Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Prime and Load podcast. I'm here with doctors Andrew Bamford and Alex Burns, and today we have on a good friend of ours, Mark Canady, who we've known for probably more than we'd like to admit, but we're going to talk today about the reenacting hobby. And the three of us are on the American side of the waters, but I know, Andrew, you reenact quite a bit in the UK, and there might be some differences. But when we talk about the reenacting hobby, we're talking mostly about what we do here on this side, and maybe in other episodes we'll talk more to the UK side of things. But yeah, Mark, do you want to tell us a little bit about your reenacting experience?
Yeah. Do you want to start with how I got interested in the hobby?
Yeah. Let's start there.
So the precursor to this is that I was born into a family that put a premium on family time that was educational. If it was entertaining, so much the better. But we didn't go to amusement parks or water parks. We went to a lot of historic sites and museums and things of that nature. Um, we didn't have a lot of material things, so if I wasn't playing outside, there was a lot of reading. I had found a wealth of book series that really fostered that, like the old Landmark series of books and things like that. So I guess you could say that I was kind of born into an environment that set the preconditions to love history, and then as an extension of that, reenacting. So I grew up in a very rural part of southern Indiana. The predominant historical site that my family would go to was in Vincennes, Indiana. In early 1779, there was a battle that took place in Vincennes at Fort Sackville during the American Revolution. So there's an annual reenactment there. And literally, my very first memory as a child was being at a reenactment at Vincennes, and I was completely enthralled by that. So I kind of always knew that I wanted to do that. And fortunately, I was able to at a very young age.
And so, Mark, like, obviously, your acquaintance with Lee and I goes back to like 2014, but even before then, like as a teenager, you were involved in the Northwest Territory Association out in the Midwest, and then for a time you also we did stuff. You would drive out further east for like larger reenactments. Like, what is it like to reenact the Revolutionary War when you live in Indiana? I mean, that can it be challenging?
Yeah, it definitely is. So I was fortunate in that we went to that same historic site, that National Historical Park, so much that I eventually became a volunteer at the park there and met people somewhat local to me who were already involved in reenacting through the Northwest Territory Alliance. Um, there's no formal bias in that organization for reenacting for doing stuff that took place in the backcountry, but it just so happened that everyone that I knew that was local to me kind of focused on backcountry Virginians or backcountry Whigs, things of that nature. I think I was really fortunate at that very young age. I was in my early teens when all this took place. That I met some incredibly generous people. My parents never got involved in the hobby. We met local folks who they came to trust, and I would go to reenactments with a good friend of ours. And then this is also at the time where the availability of the internet became kind of a household thing. And I'm going to date myself, but this is around the time that AOL would mail out CDs. So all of the information about reenacting on the internet it was very new, kind of felt very naive and optimistic, but it was an exciting time. Units were creating websites, and it was kind of neat to get a glimpse of things going on in other areas. Um, I don't know. It's kind of it seemed to me that maybe it was also kind of a period of transition in the reenacting hobby, where people who had initially started reenacting the American Revolution during the bicentennial were starting to move past that, and the same people, the same core participants were involved, but they were evolving as that bicentennial was over for a few years at that point. So it was good for me. I was being a teenager. I didn't realize at the time it's kind of a high water mark of having free time on my hands and the freedom to pursue hobbies. So it was good. So I maybe I'm kind of getting ahead of us here. Um, when I initially developed this strong interest, it was absolutely an interest in the the Whig side of that story that I talked about that took place at Fort Sackville in 1779. But ultimately, I came around to want to represent the British side of that story, and from there met even further very good people, very generous people that facilitated my entrance in the hobby.
Mark, could you just, and forgive me, as these two will know, not only am I an ignorant Brit, I'm also a Brit particularly ignorant of the American Revolutionary War. Very briefly, what happened at Fort Sackville that is the basis for what you were talking about?
So earlier in the 1770s, there was a development of people going west of the Appalachian or Allegheny Mountains to settle in the Ohio River Valley, Kentucky, particularly. And that became kind of a conflict point because the Shawnee and to a lesser extent, I think the Cherokee viewed that as their private hunting preserve. So I can't recall exactly when Kentucky became a county of Virginia. Several persons involved in the Virginia militia, such as George Rogers Clark, wanted to do what they could to stem the flow of supplies to native war parties. So George Rogers Clark went back to Virginia and approached the governor with a plan to raise state regulars and go and attack several posts in the Illinois country. And ultimately, he wanted to go to Detroit to neutralize the British presence and influence in the area. So he did just that. In July 1778, Clark pushed into the Illinois country, initially took Kaskaskia, and follow-on operations took Cahokia, both in Illinois, present Illinois, and then subsequently Vincennes in Indiana. After that happened, the British, the civil authority, the lieutenant governor in Detroit found out about this and organized an expedition to take back the Illinois country. They set out to head to Vincennes in late 1778, and they arrived in Vincennes and retook what was Fort Sackville in December. So this was just a counterattack from Clark to retake Vincennes from the British.
Oh, thank you. No, that's an area of the war I know nothing about. So I didn't even realise it was it extended to so far west that early. So that's fascinating. Thank you,
Mark. Your summary is great. I just a couple points for listeners who maybe aren't as in the weeds as all of us. When Mark's talking about Whigs, that's what frequently in modern America we call the Patriots. Right, so these are folks who are on the congressional side of the split, and it's a contemporary term. It's a term I use in my classes at Franciscan, but it's a term maybe we have not used a lot on this podcast yet. I'd also say, can you, Mark, tell us a little about the consistency of this war party, or just war parties in the upper country generally on the British side in the War of Independence? It's a mixed war party. What is it mixed of? Like, what various types of soldier or individuals are part of a war party like this?
So key to this is understanding that the British military establishment had very, very few troops to allocate to the Great Lakes posts that were also controlling, if not by actually occupying the territory through their influence, the Illinois country and the Ohio River Valley. One regiment in particular, the 8th Regiment, the King's Regiment. So there are a number of expeditions that take place in the backcountry on the fringes of upstate New York and Pennsylvania throughout the war that feature mixed war parties with a number of British regulars, usually from the 8th Regiment afoot, quite often Loyalist soldiers or regulars from various units such as Butler's Rangers, the King's Royal Regiment of New York, and quite a few others, but those are the ones most commonly known to people. And then quite a few native warriors of various tribes. In some cases, warriors from the Six Nations. In some cases, warriors from even as far afield as the Sac and Fox. So it varies a lot, but it's really interesting in that these are British regulars on the fringes of the empire, so to speak, that are operating jointly with a very diverse element, traveling way outside of the normal range of operations and striking pretty far afield.
That's great, Mark. And I am seeing, at least in my mind, the possibility that you may return and walk us through some of the key 250th anniversaries up in the upper country, which would delight me as also a native Hoosier to no end. But just, can you tell us, so obviously we all, Lee, you reenact as the 8th of Foot of the King's Regiment. What are some other impressions that you mentioned doing like Virginia Whigs or like sort of Patriot backcountry militia? What other impressions have you done over the course of your career in reenacting? Is that the right way to say it? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe I could kind of touch on what drew me to do to represent the British side of that initial story that we talked about. Being in my early teens, I was really enamored of the professionalism and the competence of these British soldiers that fought so far away from not only from their homes but from their posts. And I at the time I kind of viewed them as not as a parade ground perfect automaton, but just incredibly hyper disciplined soldiers, maybe in the vein of what we think of as Prussians from the time period. And with time, I came to find that perception was incredibly flawed, and the truth was far more interesting to me. But the core truth of competence and tactical excellence, I feel, kind of remained. So initially, I started doing the King's Regiment. Like I said, the relevance to me is kind of local history, I suppose. And from there, I branched out. And from there, I reenacted for a little bit in the 40th Regiment of Foot, the Light Infantry Company. And I took a hiatus from the hobby for professional reasons for about 8 years, from about 2002 to 2010. And when I came back to the hobby, I also concurrently moved back to Southern Indiana and kind of picked up where I'd left off doing King's Regiment. At the same time, it's everything I say is from a lens of a deep interest in the American Revolution. And coming at this from the perspective of being involved in or fascinated by my local history, I was equally interested in the backcountry, the rural Virginians that fought at the same place in defense of settlement in Kentucky. So, on the side, I would do backcountry Whig reenacting a little bit, and then I served for a while in the U.S. Army. That kind of fostered a very deep interest in the Continental Army as kind of the predecessors of what I did, and I suppose you could say I kind of cast about to find what I thought was like the pinnacle of competence and professionalism of the Continental Army, and I kind of found myself really fascinated by the contributions of Maryland and Delaware soldiers as they fought in the Southern campaigns. So really specifically, I became interested in and convinced all my friends to reenact a Continental Light Infantry formation that was a composite battalion of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia soldiers that was constituted after the Continental troops at Camden were really brought by a lot of casualties, and it required reconsolidation of the remaining troops. So when that occurred, they went ahead and picked chosen men, one might say, to become a special light infantry battalion that served with great distinction at the Battle of Cowpens and perhaps most famously at Cowpens. But they continued to serve and conduct screening operations and things of that nature throughout the remainder of the war in the South.
That's great. So how would you describe reenacting and maybe some of the internal politics of reenacting? So there are different ways that you could approach reenacting, right? You could view reenacting as a way to go and like shoot some guns and drink beer out of a cooler while wearing a sort of a costume on the weekends, or you could view it maybe in a more serious way where you're going to be like almost like pretending to be on campaign, going on like long distance hikes in period garb and period shoes, trying to see how the soldiers felt. I mean, obviously there are a lot of epithets thrown out like mainstreamer or stitch Nazi or various ways that you try to delineate maybe the level of authenticity or the level of seriousness by which people pursue this hobby. Where are you at on this spectrum, and why did you end up going in that direction?
I came to the table here prepared to answer so much of that question aside from what I would call myself. So I'm just going to launch into a response and we'll see how it pans out. Um, a lot of what I think about this hobby is kind of influenced by the fact that I view it as an outward facing hobby where there's a public audience and therefore there's a duty to educate or at the very least to portray history in a way that's to the best of our abilities so as not to misinform. Um, Without that, it's kind of a really self-indulgent thing to take part in, I think. And there's nothing really wrong with that. And some forms of the hobby do take that shape, including ones we've all participated in, had a lot of fun with. But as long as the public is there, I think we have a duty to do things right. It kind of becomes an ethical thing. I suppose I do think the hobby is kind of, I was going to say fractured, perhaps branched off would be a better way to say it in recent years, perhaps over the last like 15 or so years or a little bit more. When I entered the hobby, it was into what would unquestionably called a mainstream group. And that, you spoke of epithets and different terms that could be used to describe the hobby. And kind of the baseline paradigm for the hobby is what you described, a group of friends that gets together on weekends and they put on public events and then they kind of let their hair down in the evenings and, open a cooler of drinks and have fun around a campfire. And I think I have nothing bad to say about that. Earlier when I spoke of the internet being not a new innovation when I was a teenager, but still pretty, I don't know, a relatively new resource, it kind of facilitated a discovery for me. Being in the Midwest, there were a lot of large reenactment groups that portray units of the American Revolution along the East Coast that I didn't have access to at that point, didn't see. But there was a lot more information on the internet to be absorbed about Civil War reenactors that took a different approach than that normal paradigm that we just talked about. And they variously called themselves campaigners or progressives or hardcore. And over time, those terms, some of them have fallen by the wayside for various reasons. And I think that they found themselves in use for various reasons. A campaigner being indicative of reenactment units that tried to pare down material possessions away from comfort items that seem pseudo period correct to just have what an infantry soldier in austere conditions would have. And that makes sense. And I think that's pretty valid. It's pretty important if that's appropriate to the historical context you're trying to portray, right? If you're portraying troops, occupying Boston in 1774, it's not really right necessarily to just live on the ground with a blanket. So everything should be appropriate to the setting. But that's kind of the origin of that term. So I suppose on my own, within the events that I went to, within the unit I went to, I started trying to implement stuff like that. I would take my clothing and remake it with hand stitching and kind of learn as I went and uh, make biscuit at home and try to eat in an appropriate manner. And I think probably much to the amusement of the people that I spent time around, and or maybe amusement is the right way to phrase it. But I don't know. It was kind of, I think, maybe good for me to meet people from all approaches. As time has gone on and people become more interconnected, I think that there's maybe more branching out within the hobby, with people taking those various approaches to different
So,
extremes.
Andrew, would you say that sort of a similar dichotomy or division occurs in the United Kingdom between like folks who are basically there to have a good time and also think about history versus folks who, you know, sleep on the ground and do long distance marches and hand stitch their own clothing? I mean, is this common in the UK as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think, and it's probably coming because it may surprise the American part of the audience. There was, and to some extent still is, quite a big American Civil War reenactment scene in the UK, and I think it came, as Mark's outlined, from groups who were doing that that patrol and had connections with groups on your side of the water. I guess what you maybe see a little bit more is you might have a group, and probably most of the ones I've been in would fall under this heading. That maybe the group would be maybe what you'd characterise as mainstream, but then people within it might, okay, we're gonna come in what you maybe call a campaign portrayal for this event, or you know what, we're going to have a private event and we're going to do this thing. Or it might be, okay, you know, we're open to the public for these as, okay, we're eating, you know, in my case, you're mostly doing French portrayals, you know, pea soup or something, but after hours we might still, you know, like you say, break open the cooler. So I think there's maybe a little bit more flexibility within it in the UK in most of the groups that I've worked with. There are certainly some, and the American War of Independence scene is taking off in a big way over here. As we come into the anniversaries, and certainly some of the groups that are setting up for that are explicitly setting up with the higher end standard that you're talking about, and a very serious approach. But equally, they're happy to work at bigger events, and maybe this is something, I don't know if this is the case for you. You know, that if you're going to put on a big event, groups from all across that spectrum will come together and cooperate to put on a larger show.
So, Mark, we've mentioned a few impressions that you do. You do the Whig, the British. If someone were to ask you what they should do, what do you think would be things to consider? Like if you were giving advice to somebody new to the hobby.
So, all else being equal, I think the first thing I would tell them to do is find a group of people that they're socially compatible with. You know, the two principal impressions that I spoke of are impressions that I do all with the same group. We're a group that primarily does King's Regiment, as you guys have spoken of. We all do that together. And we do that Continental impression as our alternate impression. And, you know, it's kind of funny to me that when I was a teenager, there were several times I wanted to start a group that would kind of have, kind of have aligned interests and things that I felt were maybe perhaps a little lacking in the groups that I was in at the time. And it never really panned out. And as it turned out, that when I stopped trying to create something, the right people kind of turned up in my life, and we formed a cadre of friends around that, and formed a group together. So it may be a little trite. I would say first find your people, find people that you want to spend time with, find people that have the same outlook on how to present history that you have, and I think a lot of times things kind of fall in place. So if you find people that have the same priorities you do, it'll probably be an impression that you like doing. But having said that, you know, without being too Pollyanna, there's a lot of really, really good people in this hobby. There's a lot of really good units in this hobby. So I think it's pretty likely that you'll find something that aligns with what you want to do that also is a good social fit and a good match for your priorities. You know, when it comes just simply to picking what kind of impression do I want to do, I suppose I don't know of another way than the one that I use, which is to say things that I think are relevant to me or things that I admire.
And a cool uniform doesn't hurt either.
Oh, absolutely. Trip or die.
I'm curious, guys, with the two portrayals that you do, you say you do the X, but you do the alternative one as the Continental Light Infantry. Do you find you receive differently at all? I mentioned I do mostly reenactment of the French in Britain, and occasionally, very occasionally within the hobby, a little bit more from the public. That sometimes draws down a negative perception. You know, why do you want to be the bad guys? Do you find when you know as redcoats in the US, is that ever an issue?
Occasionally, mildly. You know, I think I mentioned that I'm more or less back in the very rural area that I grew up in, back in the very rural area that those King's Regiment soldiers fought in. And so even if people don't have a deep emotional investment in history, they certainly still see those redcoats as the bad guys. But it's probably a very gentle ribbing. So yeah, the answer is yes, but it's not a very heartfelt malice.
I think also, I mean, I'm sure this is the case in the United Kingdom. I mean, in America, I want to say there's a perception that the bad guys are like dangerous, fun, and sexy. And so like the who would not want to be a redcoat? I mean, you're part of the the best army in the world, quote unquote, right? I mean, there are a lot of things I think that could sell it. Now, and Andrew, you're the bad guys in so many ways, not just the French, but also like the Irish fight in French service, right? What is it do you think attracts us? Now, obviously, Lee and Mark and I also do American stuff, but what is it that attracts us to not want to portray the nation that we are in? Like, is it a little odd that maybe all of our primary impressions are not the country that we live in and pay taxes in? What's going on there?
I mean, I would say when I'm being a Jacobite, I'm usually the dangerous romantic rebel. So
that's right. That's right. You and Sam Heughan just like this. Yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly. When we do that, then the redcoats suddenly morph into the bad guys. Even in this country, it's the whole repulsive but right and romantic but wrong thing, I suspect. Yeah. But I mean, my case, and I think I've said this on the podcast before already. I spend all week writing about redcoats. It's quite therapeutic to go and shoot a few on a weekend, but that's maybe a unique take on the situation.
I think there's also a portion of it, like Mark said, it's a public-facing hobby, and with the bad guys, I feel like it always comes a little bit of a stigma or a thought process that may or may not be entirely accurate. So coming to not necessarily correct anybody, but kind of right some perceptions or adjust some perceptions, I think I think you have to have a special gluttony for punishment to take that on. So
there's more educational work to do or something like that.
I think that could be part of it. Yeah.
I absolutely think so. So it's going to come as no shock to not only people on this panel, but also probably listeners, that there is a perception that British soldiers serving in North America throughout the 18th century were, like I said earlier, parade ground perfect automatons or fops or something of that nature. So when you're able to, especially in smaller face-to-face interactions, kind of break that stigma with the public and talk about who those guys really were and how they actually operated, even leaving aside the larger operational strategic goals of the British government during the war, I think it's pretty valuable. It's pretty fulfilling as well to be able to kind of put a human face on something, and a human face that someone could recognize as being not so unlike themselves in certain ways.
And so there's a lot that goes into these impressions. I think as we all know, if you could think of something that is the most important part of an impression, what would you narrow that down to, if it's one thing or a few things, Mark?
So in a material sense, I would say clothing that's cut well and fit well, according to the norms of the time for fitting. I love a good hand-stitched garment as much as the next person, but visually, it's kind of jarring if something doesn't fit right. First impression is often partially formed by a visual appraisal, and clothing that's fit well is going to bring an authenticity to what you're doing in a way that kind of opens the door for further conversation and further opportunities. So it kind of, it's like an incubator to be able to broaden to other facets. Those other facets that are not material could be things such as showing the bearing or demeanor of soldiers, and whatever else you do in the course of representing a soldier or any person from the past. So I often look at that as, if you're portraying an infantry soldier under arms in formation, being competent, being disciplined, being authentic to the setting represented. So, sometimes discipline can be perceived as having your eye aligned with your waistcoat buttons or how perfectly a musket's shouldered, but it really also, in the sense of being a soldier, is keeping up on a march when you're extremely underrested and underfed or malnourished, loading a musket rapidly under fire and leveling well and taking good aim fire. So basically, I suppose in a nutshell, excellence in all you do. But when you start with a basis of having good kit that gives you some credibility, you can expound on that by acting like one would in that setting.
So you mentioned something that I love, the idea of having the bearing of a soldier. And being a vet, I know that single phrase, I recognize it, I understand it, but I know that is not necessarily a household term for people who don't have that experience. If you try, how do you try to explain that to other reenactors if you ever were to find yourself in that situation? Like it's a tough thing to communicate. It's one of those, if you know, but communicating it's a good thing because
Yeah.
it is important.
So looking like a soldier is not just wearing a patrol cap a certain way, right? When you see someone out and they're paying attention to their surroundings and they're taking things in, and they don't look threatening, but they look capable. They look like they're switched on, to use another kind of jargon. So yeah, I think that even in this context, looking like a soldier is looking capable and paying attention to what's going on and being competent at what you do.
And also, I think being aware of your personal appearance, right? I mean, if I can share an anecdote of sort of life in the trenches with Mark. Mark and I drove out to Virginia for a Battle of Yorktown reenactment in 2015, I think, or late 2014. I can't remember exactly what it was. It may have been like September of 2014. Anyway, so this was like a hardcore progressive or campaign, or however you want to frame it, reenactment. And so we were sleeping on the ground in, sort of Virginia in the fall, and it wasn't terribly comfortable. I was sort of early in the hobby then. I kind of am getting up, stretching my arms, and Mark sits up like bolt upright, and he looks at me like, "Does my roller look well?" Like, is he? He's trying to make sure that his neck cloth is aligned properly. And I'm thinking like, man, I need some coffee, and this guy is like bothering me about whether or not his neck cloth looks right. Like 4 hours before the public is going to get here. I mean, it's a commitment, I think, in some ways, to trying to look well. It goes a long way towards ensuring that you have the appropriate bearing, in addition to making sure your hat is, sort of cocked on a jaunty angle, and, sort of, the various things. But it's more like an inner state of being, I think, as opposed to just checking off lists or something like this.
So you talked about the unit you've got. When you take the field, do you feel like either yourself or your unit has a particular goal? Like, do you get, all right, guys, this is what we're trying to do, and this is how we're going to try and do it? Do you ever define that with your group?
Yeah, I think part of what's going to comprise my answer as I keep speaking here is going to touch on things I've already brought up. One of those things is that the way the hobby has kind of broadened and branched out, and that's been a good thing in the sense that people within reenacting are bringing representation to a number of historical roles that kind of fell between the cracks of reenacting in the past. And that's a good thing. But I don't want to see a portrayal of infantry soldiers fighting for their various causes to get lost in that broadening effort. So, I often talk within the group about approaching this hobby in the vein of portraying a wartime infantry soldier. And that's the priority. So, we want to do a good job of representing these men in camp, but we want to credibly portray infantrymen at war when we're under arms in formation. So that means technical and tactical competence. That means looking like soldiers when we're doing the business of soldiering. And that maybe that too sounds kind of trite. I think that's pretty important. We came to this to reenact soldiers at war, and so that's key to the impression.
Our next question is going to be, I think, for those of us who reenact the King's Regiment, very poignant. As much as we would love to have a time machine, when you've got gaps in research, do you have a particular method for addressing those?
So once again, I'm going to reference past statements. I was really, really lucky when I started this hobby to have a lot of people that really took me under the wing, took good care of me as a young person. And I've said before, sometimes when I talk to Alex or Dr. Burns about things, that you will be discussing research and we'll be talking about sources, and I'll say that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And it's always true. One of the people that leaps to the forefront of my mind when I say that is a gentleman named Steve Rader. from a pretty early age, I met Steve, and he was key to my understanding of primary sources. He introduced me to a lot of things that have since been published, but weren't at the time. He answered a great many of my questions, and he also would take and respond to my questions in a way that caused me to investigate further rather than spoon feeding me answers. But I say that to explain that he also articulated a really good answer to this question, or at least I perceive it to be, still do. And that the best thing to do when you have a gap or a divide in documented knowledge is to look at the concrete or solid known points on either side of that divide and bridge that gap with the most conservative approach that you can.
Obviously, Mark, when we do the King's Regiment, there's a lot of unknowns. I mean, for one, for a period of 2.5 years, their clothing issue is delayed. We don't know if, for example, are they part of Burgoyne's Canadian Army and adapting their uniforms to look like the Canadian Army, or are they not? And so can you guide us through at some like concrete moments what does, in interpreting the King's Regiment, what does the most conservative choice look like in any sort of given situation?
Yeah, so a good, really specific in the weeds example may be leg wear. That is to say breeches or trousers and gaiters and leggings. That we can look at a baseline or a norm of cloth or woolen breeches and tall black gaiters with stiff tops. That's pretty conventional. It's laid out in the royal clothing warrant that dictated the uniforms of soldiers and regiments of foot. And yet we also, so that's that concrete, that known point on the left side of this divide. It seems unlikely that soldiers operating in Kentucky and New York and Western Pennsylvania were wearing stiff top gaiters. And another, we have a lot of data points from other units in North America during the American Revolution wearing things that are significantly more practical. For instance, before the war began, in a peacetime sense, there were references to wearing linen breeches or hemp breeches in the summer. And we have data points that point to this, in fact, being not only just a good idea, but very much the case in North America. There are instances of British regiments cutting up old tents to make trousers, which is the term for gaiter trousers. That is to say, trousers that fit very snugly and then close around the ankle with buttons and have a flap over the buckle of the shoe, much like gaiters would. There are a lot of references to cloth being shipped over for the use of the Army at large in North America. When I say cloth, I shouldn't say cloth, but when I say cloth, typically I mean wool. And we have references to Russia duck or Russia drill or hemp fabrics that are sent to be made as breeches or trousers for hot weather campaigning. So I think you could say that we have a gap in that we think that they weren't wearing cloth breeches and long gaiters all throughout the entire war in the various duties in which they were assigned. And we have a lot of data points that show that other British regiments were wearing linen or hemp gaiter trousers. It's a pretty conservative take to say that they likely were as well. We can specifically point to units that we absolutely know they served with that wore linen gaiter trousers. Therefore, it's not too great or unethical a leap to say that they likely did too. That's a good example, I would say, of trying to extrapolate to make up for a gap in primary source documented knowledge.
I enjoy that, finding your two sides and trying to build a logic bridge to the center. And so switching to events, what kind of events do you like to do? Like if you had to pick a flavor of event, what would it be?
Well, maybe it's a cop out. I can honestly say I like a lot of different kinds of events. This question actually kind of leads us back to that conversation of different terms or approaches to reenacting, whether mainstream or campaigner. So the norm is kind of a big national event with a lot of participants and relatively few formal opportunities for interpretation or communication with the public in an educational way, and large battles. I do enjoy those, especially when they're set in a venue that I find to be historically significant and a place I want to go to, whether it's Guilford Courthouse or Mount Vernon or something like that. So I enjoy those. I also really enjoy immersion events. And, when I talked about this being an outward facing hobby, immersion events are the inward facing component where we do events that don't feature an audience of the public. They're kind of a free form thing with no rigid schedule. And they're an attempt on our part to try to live as they lived and experience things as they did. So it's kind of it's a way of trying to educate oneself through experience.
Awesome. And do you have a favorite event or some favorite events that stand out in your mind? And I guess we could open this up to everyone too.
Yeah. So for my part, it's not just my own, but I think a group standout favorite is an event that we took part in 2015 in Welborn, Virginia. That was an immersion event. It was a great venue, not a historic site, but a venue that featured a lot of really nice terrain without a lot of modern intrusions that allowed us to kind of immerse ourselves, as the term implies. So it was a great setting. There were a lot of other units that were there that I find to be great comrades and good people to be around and set the tone for a good time. And also, once again, alluding to something I said before, it was a time of growth in our particular group. We had a lot of new people come in. We already knew that we were all going to be great friends. But eating scant food and spooning in the rain is a great bonding experience for a core of friends. So Wellburn stands out for sure, and I know I hear that echoed from a lot of guys that were there in the group. I also have to reference one that you, I think, also remember fondly, Lee, and that's Currytown, New York, that we went to in 2016. And that was kind of unique because there was a gentleman who took a mainstream event and created kind of a sideline, I guess. He set it up such that those who was portraying the King's Regiment could operate with those portraying Native warriors from the Six Nations as a war party. And we essentially infiltrated an area en route to the mainstream event. And it was pretty amazing just simply because we were a war party with no one else in sight prowling through upstate New York. I think when I say that, it kind of undersells it, but it really was pretty special to me.
I remember at one point we were just taking a security pause on a farm, and the organizer went and knocked upon the guy's door, and all I could think of, even though we're kind of crouching next to a John Deere, this is so cool because it's, at least like spiritually very similar to what these guys were doing. It was that was a good one.
Yeah, absolutely it was.
What about you, Andrew? Do you have a specific event that sticks out in your mind?
I think probably two ends of things. I've done more with my Napoleonic reenactment, some big battles on the actual battlefields, Waterloo, Jena, and they stand out hugely for that. I think that my all-time favourite is an event we did with the French-Irish group, the Irish Pickets. So during the 45 rebellion, we got invited up to Scotland to the Highland Folk Museum at Newton Moor, which is a recreated Highland village. And the group that invited us were running. It was a public event, but it was active all day, if you like. There wasn't, it's 4 o'clock. We're all going to film up for the battle now, and then that's the grand finale, and then we'll go home. There were 3 or 4 skirmishes planned throughout the day. We knew roughly what was going to happen when, because you charging around the public, firing guns and willy-nilly. But we made the point. Okay, we're going to. Not immersive in the way you're talking about, because, like I say, it was a public event. But we say, we're going to live a military day. We're going to do as close as we can with the numbers we've got to soldiers on duty. Part of the units on call all the time, and working with people who had a similar approach to it. That made the difference. I mean, it was a small event. 18th century events in the UK inevitably are, but that's the one that I still remember fondly many years on. Actually, that was going to be a question I was going to ask you. Moving on from there, you said, Mark, something like fairly big event or fairly good numbers. I mean, what is a big event, or what's an average event in terms of numbers on your side of the water?
That's an incredibly fair question. I have no idea. A few hundred. My my vague memory of national events prior to 2000, or like say early in 2001, were that they were probably, gosh, I don't know, 70% bigger maybe than the national events have seemed in recent years. I guess I would, at a rough estimate, maybe 200 to 400 men under arms per side would be on the big end of it.
Yeah, I'm just in envy. I mean, I say I've done big Napoleonic events, but I don't think you could get that many. If you got every 18th century reenactor in the UK and were together in one place, I don't think you'd get those sort of numbers. That's incredible
Right.
to have that.
To be fair, those numbers probably only appear in any one place, maybe 2 to 3 times a year in America, I would suppose.
Yeah, I mean, even for the large, Lexington and Concord Battle Road event that's getting ready to happen this weekend, I think they're only on the British side. They're still expecting fewer than 1,000. So I mean, it's certainly not as large as Civil War or Napoleonics over in Europe, where I mean, at Waterloo, for the 200th anniversary, were there not like multiple thousand reenactors on each side? Andrew?
There were, and even I didn't do that one, but I did the two on the 190th and the 195th, and they were equally big. Yeah, I mean certainly as they were building up to the big Waterloo, every year was multiple thousands, but that was reenactors from all over Europe. That again was fairly atypical.
So, kind of on that note, a question for everyone. Before we leave the section on kind of, what drives you as a reenactor, what's your philosophy of reenacting? Do we think it's helpful? Not in like, do we think it's fun? But do we think it's helpful in terms of it gives you a better understanding of the past? Do you ever have experiences at reenactments and think, wow, I've got a greater insight into what the past was like as a result of this experience?
I think so, yes. Obviously, it probably varies a lot by impression. Again, I'm coming at this from the lens of the wartime infantry soldier. So obviously, hopefully it's incredibly obvious, it's going to be limited in reenacting. There are certainly some of the everyday aspects, or nearly everyday aspects, of being a soldier you can capture. One wouldn't want to deprive oneself of food for any great length of time, but you can absolutely go to an event and live outside for 36 or 48 hours and go fairly hungry, or at the very least go without food that satisfies oneself. You can absolutely be tired and be rained on, or live in the heat and the cold, and from that derive a little bit of the experience of being a soldier. And I think I've seen a few times where people even experience just a little bit of the adrenaline dump as well. Things happen unexpectedly. NCOs run back over a hill screaming that horse is approaching, and there are things here and there where you can get just a glimpse of that feeling.
I get the feeling as well sometimes the events with the bad weather. I mean, they can be utterly miserable, but they can often bring out the camaraderie, which you feel would be the same camaraderie that would have got people through it back in the day. I'm not saying I fondly remember. Maybe I can fondly remember them now, years on. But there are some events that have been absolutely atrocious weather. But we've pulled it together and got a display on for the public. Well, the equivalent, I guess, be we've pulled it together and we're still able to put our unit into the field. So I hadn't really thought about that until something you said, Mark, just triggered the idea. The thing I was going to say as well was, I mean, certainly the first time I did a route march, authentic shoes, full kit, you really get a new respect doing that for people who are doing it day in, day out. I mean, it's a different experience entirely.
I've joked in the past that I was going to set up an immersion event for the guys where we just walked in the Continental clothing at about a 4-mile-an-hour pace for hours, and then we would stop and cook, and before we were able to eat, we would just walk off again rapidly and kind of get that race to the Dan experience, and lay out our blankets and in the cold and lay down, then get up and keep walking at that rapid 4-mile-an-hour pace for a few hours more.
That would definitely be you remember it was cool. It's cool now, not so much then sort of experience.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean the one that always stands out to my mind is I'm reading for my dissertation in the letters of these Prussian soldiers, and they talk about they were out all night and it rained and they were very stiff. And then that late fall into winter, we went out for the event we did in Kentucky. Was it in 2018 or 2019?
Yeah.
And we were snowed on. And so like I woke up and I was like, I had a little blanket on and I was covered in snow. I was like, oh, so that's what he meant by feeling pretty stiff. Okay. All right. So, it's, you don't stay as long as they would in that type of situation. I mean, they can't get in their car and in my case, drive to Dairy Queen afterwards. But by that same token, it's like while you're there for that moment, you get a tiny experience of the difficulty of like the ordinary difficulty of daily life in the past. I don't know that I've ever been in a combat situation in reenacting and thought, wow, I've learned a lot about exactly how they were feeling in combat. There are moments when horses have concerned me a great deal, and I thought, do I really want to be here? But you don't get that same kind of like life and death experience, I don't think. But yeah, I guess my opinion is I'm kind of two minds on experimental archaeology. I think it definitely adds something. What I wouldn't give if all military historians were like forced to reenact a little bit. But by the same token, I'm not sure that it gives like pure fire 100% correct takes, all the time, one for one experiences, things like this.
Yeah. I think it also depends on almost to a what end sort of question, if interpreting for the public is a major priority, does getting rained on help you do that? I don't know. I think you're like what Mark said, I think it can help to an extent, and to how long are you willing to do it? I think one of the big experiences that I would love to see in the hobby that at least we don't see in the American Revolution hobby is kind of the time on station, the ability to be there for long enough to get into mostly a camp routine. I know from what I understand, there's some Civil War events that go for maybe a week on end, but there's a certain rhythm of life that you get into when you're in the field for extended periods. And I think that would be incredibly telling for people who don't have those experiences. What is it like to wake up 3 days into the field, or 4 or 5 or 6 days into the field, and then continuing on with whatever that mission is? I think that would be an awesome thing, as much as it is difficult to get people to, leave their real world lives for, weeks at a time. I don't know. I don't think that's ever going to be a thing. I think it would be a cool thing to do, though. But
I think at one time it was a thing. I think the unit is defunct now, but in that time I spoke of, when the internet was new and reenacting was new to Mark Canady, there was a group in the hobby called the Company of Select Marksmen, and what they portrayed was within the Northern Army under Burgoyne, there was a company-sized element of troops that were chosen for work for screening and scouting operations and things like that. So this was a Canadian, or maybe a lot of upstate New Yorkers in this group, and I think they did do week-long trips to the Adirondacks with a lot of marching.
I've once done a 4-day event, which coming away from that was, and it wasn't just me. This was commented on. Normally you do a weekend and Sunday night you're ready to go home. You've had fun. You've done what you came to do. And it was almost like this one. We broke that and kept going, and we're just getting into. And I'd have loved to have carried that on, and I think that was the feeling. But it just felt like we were actually getting somewhere into that routine. But it was just a one-off event, and we never got a chance to, with the group in question anyway, to do that again. But that was something that was commented on by others other than myself.
Maybe the 250th will inspire somebody to start up a week-long Rev War event. So I guess the last question we have in this section is, and again, this could go out to everyone, what do you feel makes an event successful? We've talked about a bunch of different events we like, but do you think there's hallmarks for what you would call a successful event?
I think that the venue or the setting is incredibly important to me. and this is kind of a, the selfish answer. I really like being able to do it in a historic site that is applicable to what's being represented optimally. And a great example that springs to mind is Guilford Courthouse. Within our group, we've for several years running, we would, at the end of the reenactment day, into the duty day, we would all walk around the battlefield, and Dr. Burns would relate to us the course of the battle, and we would just even get hangers on from other groups that realized what we were doing and want to participate. And I think it's a great way to tie in the educational aspect with all the other aspects of the hobby. So venue is hugely important to me. I alluded to it when I was talking about Wellburn. Doing it in conjunction with other groups that constitute friends and like-minded people is also really important. So that's the inward-facing stuff. If there's going to be a public audience, obviously, I want to have the opportunity to speak to them and figure out what drew them to this period of history, or just to this historic site, or this weird reenactment on this day, and try to communicate with them and educate to the extent possible.
I would say for me, a combination of the education, but also sort of getting outside your comfort zone and meeting new people and meeting new groups. I think outside of the reenacting I've done with you all, and we've already hit some of the highlights, the event in Kentucky and Wellburn. One of the most meaningful reenactments I've done was actually over in Europe. We sort of with a Prussian group in Germany, and it was a helpful reminder that like not everyone is the same as they are online, right? There was a Polish gentleman who maybe the future guest of this podcast will see, who was kind of a keyboard warrior in some ways, or at least came across as kind of a well, I won't say that, but he was not super polite, and he reached out to me and it was like, I'm going to be at this event. You should be up. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, like I'm going to have to meet this guy in person. And he was just the sweetest man in person, not at all like he was like online. And we just had an incredible time. We did an 18-mile road march and ate sort of like green corn, off of the stem. And I was sick. Like sort of violently ill during this reenactment, and I felt like that was a great experience. And he was like, "Hey man, drink some more, Brunchwein," and I was like, "Oh great." So just reenacting is a hobby that is not always sane, and that is a beautiful thing, and it's a feature, not a bug. So I would say embrace the oddities of reenacting, and you'll go far.
Yeah, I mean, not a great deal to add to this. There's nothing that anybody said I disagree with, and I've probably already mentioned most of my favourite events. I think the thing that makes an event successful, though, and it can be in different ways, different sorts of events. Everybody there's got to be in the same mindset. When that's what clicks, and I'm quite happy to say there are times I want to go out and play soldiers and run around and have some beers with my friends afterwards, and there's times I want to get into a more immersive historical experience, but if you've got half the guys want to do one thing and half the guys want to do the other thing, it's not going to work. When you've got people who, like I was talking about the event I went to in Scotland that I enjoyed so much, we all went with a goal in mind, and we did what we set out to do. We had a great time doing it, and that's what makes it work, I think.
Yeah, I agree with everything. The only thing I would add is I enjoy events where you contextually do the right things for the events. And I know I've done an event at a local site where they did a program in the 4 different languages, French, English, and 2 native languages. That's a really cool thing to do. Or when you paddle across Lake Champlain, another unique thing in a unique place, doing those kind of specific tasks is another really cool thing. And if you can do them in the right places, all the better. But then of course there's being with the boys doing fun things. That's never a bad thing. Never a bad time. Okay. So moving on to our next kind of series of questions. Mark, how do you feel if you were to give a state of the hobby speech? What would you include in that? How would you describe our wacky hobby?
Such a loaded question.
Yeah, don't
I
offend
guess-
anyone, Mark.
Yeah.
Right. There's no way I could thread that needle. I'll still give it a shot. So for starters, I think this is maybe a really common refrain in probably in all periods of reenacting. I guess I see our corner of the hobby, this period is kind of struggling to bring in new blood. Like I said, when I started doing it, um, people that reenacted the bicentennial were like the age that I am now, maybe a little bit older. I haven't seen a lot of there are new members certainly, but it's not across the board. And I think perhaps I don't think this is maybe an offensive thing to say, but that they kind of gravitate towards certain units, which is natural. But there's not a leavening of new people across all elements of the hobby. That maybe kind of is a segue to my next point, where I think that the hobby is branching out, and I said this before, and it's good where it brings representation to important facets or people of the past that were underrepresented in the past. But I don't want to see that result in an abandonment of of what the hobby initially sought to do, which is to remember people that fought in the American Revolution for the future of their country and the shape that it would take on either side, and educate the public about the same. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about in regarding the state of the hobby. There's some things to maybe be concerned about, namely continuing to try to bring in new people, bring them to a love of history, and again, maybe a little Pollyanna, but trying to maybe build some bridges between those different facets or branches.
And if you could add one thing to the hobby or change one thing to maybe to help those points, what do you think it would be?
So the answer that I have kind of on deck is not really very distinct from what I just said. I think that I would seek to find the common ground between, I kind of alluded to it, I guess say it, the mainstream units or elements in the hobby and some of the more progressive ones. Find some, even if only limited, find some common ground so that we could all work together for the good of educating the public. So not a great answer in that it's not very distinct from the previous one, but that's what I would want to add to the mix that is the hobby right now, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. I think like Alex, you were mentioning, I think we can just think of people by, how they present on Facebook, when in reality we're have more in common than we think we do. And I'm sure that's not just in reenacting. I'm sure that happens for everything else in the world. But so we have the 250th coming up here for the American Revolution. Are there any events that you're particularly excited for?
Yeah, selfishly, I guess keep using that word today. I'm kind of most excited for events that have to do with impressions that I particularly do. So frontier, backcountry things to do with the King's Regiment. And I guess I have a variety of reasons for wanting that, but one of them is kind of underrepresentation again. So I'm excited for, things like Newtown and Stone Arabia. Maybe kind of finding a way to do something that gets a little more public note in Vincennes, Indiana, to draw attention to that really far-flung battle. And then Southern campaign events, I mentioned Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse and the siege at Yorktown. Those are always things that I have a lot of deep personal interest in too. But generally, in keeping with the idea that it is about an anniversary celebration, any event that takes place in the original ground is going to be especially important to me, or things that take place on the good facsimile of the ground in which a battle was fought. It'd be a good experience.
And so now we're moving on to our Murmurs in the Camp section, where we pick a topic and kind of spitball it around. And our topic for today is there a person or a unit that you believe is doing a particularly good job with their impression, and why do you think that is? So we'll go all the way around the horn on this one. So Mark, if you want to start us off.
So I've got two things. on completely different ends of the spectrum. Um, the first one I'll talk about is people that do the various instances of people portraying backcountry Whigs in a militia guise. And I want to kind of explain why I say that. The American public has a lot of incorrect pop culture perceptions of the American Revolution. One of them is that it was kind of fought by guys that look like a Disney, coonskin cap and French buckskin sort of character, engaging in a really like simplistic form of guerrilla warfare, and that's not all the case. So sometimes in our rush to get away from that incorrect narrative, we kind of go really far in the other direction. But I think it's pretty neat to see guys who are doing a really good job of portraying backcountry Whigs in a really credible way. So I've seen that. I remember seeing pictures from an event that I was not personally able to attend at the Frontier Culture Museum, and seeing those guys marching through Stanton, Virginia was really cool. They looked fantastic. And I've also seen similar stuff from Martin Station in Virginia, from people from different units coming together to represent backcountry people. The other half of my answer is completely different. It's probably a really poor answer because I'm going to reference a group I don't even know if it exists anymore. About maybe 15 years ago, there were a group of guys in New England that were doing the 63rd Regiment of Foot. And this was around the time that I came back to the hobby after a hiatus. And I remember seeing photos of their kit and thinking, these guys are doing the absolute best, no holds barred material impression of British regulars that I've ever seen. And I still think that when I see pictures of them. I know a few of them not well at all. And as far as I know, most of them are still in the hobby doing various things, but I don't think they still do that impression together. But it kind of seemed like they just kind of threw all their focus and effort at it, and the results were pretty stunning. But yeah, it was kind of almost hard to narrow it down to those two. There really are a lot of people and units in this hobby doing a phenomenal job. Like I said, there's a lot to be optimistic about right now.
Yeah, I mean, if I could also take two, there are, as Mark said, an incredible number of individuals who are sort of spinning up for the 250th, and you love to see it. I would say I've been very impressed. A group out of New England, the 10th of Foot, they look very good. A lot of younger guys. I mean, I'm not trying to be ageist or whatever, but having men of the appropriate age in uniform is not a bad thing. I mean, I'm getting myself now towards the older end of the spectrum for a British soldier in the War of Independence. So it's exciting to see when units can put together guys who are maybe on the younger side of things and physically fit. That's always exciting. And then sort of a more self-serving shout out. One of my good friends, he's a former naval officer, Joshua Shop, in South Carolina, is doing an incredible job trying to revive Hessian reenacting, and particularly the Regiment von Bosa, which is musketeer regiment that fought in the South in the American War of Independence. For a while, there have been lots of Jaegers or green-coated riflemen impressions that did a pretty good job, that looked fairly well. But as far as actual like blue-coated line infantry Hessian impressions, we've kind of had a dearth of them in the United States. And so it's very exciting to see someone go out and do that well. It's something that one of the units I'm in is trying to assist with, and we're hoping that will sort of gear up and be ready for the 250th anniversary of the Hessian arrival in the United States, which is in August of next year.
Yeah, I mean the scene over here, it's so small. If I named a group, it would perhaps be a fair chunk of the total 18th century scene. I was musing over this as you were talking. I mean, I think there are certainly individuals, and I mean, I've got a couple of friends in the Redcoat group that were our friends, the enemy, who we always used to joke they look like they're falling out of a Hogarth painting. It's those people who just got it dead right. But I think the one thing I do a particular shout out for, and it'd be interesting to see what your take on this is. But we used to have, and I think they probably both retired from the scene now, but a couple of guys who did phenomenally good Native American portrayals. One of them to the point that he'd actually been adopted into the people that he was portraying, done with incredible sensitivity. Bearing in mind, obviously, there's no ethnic connection at all, but the effort and the I don't know how to phrase it. It was just downright impressive. The portrayal they came up with. And Andy and Span, if either of you are listening, you were great, and we hope to see you again. But I don't know. Is that something that you guys see on your side of the water?
We do see it, and dedication is the word that comes to my mind. I mean, it is certainly not an easy impression to do, and a very easy impression to do poorly and insensitively. So it has all the regular reenacting difficulties and then some to it. But there's some people who do a very good job. I think I have. I think I've got two, and actually one of them, Andrew, is from your side of the water. The 33rd group, I think, are doing an incredible job. I'm also, to the dismay of some parties here, I'm really into the red on red look, the red facings, but they're doing an incredible job, especially in a country that the 18th century does not seem like its main focus, especially a conflict that
Yeah, I've not seen them in the flesh, but they look phenomenal from the photographs. I know some of the guys who are involved in that project.
Mm-hmm. They look like they're doing incredible, and they've got a good number of people doing it too, which is even better. And the other one I have it's outside of our time period and is a friend of several of us here, but a buddy of ours, Gavin Lindahl, has been doing incredible World War II and recently Korean impression, and he and I are both in the same unit. He tailors his impressions to that specific unit in specific places, and he does a huge amount of research and does an incredible job. And in a time where it does seem like the World War II side of the reenacting hobby is growing, and I'm biased on that one as well, but he's doing a great job as well. So I think we've pretty much covered everything. Thank you, Mark, very much for coming on. I think this has been a lot of fun. Like Alex said, maybe we can sit down and talk a bit more about some backwoods stuff in the future.
Thank you. It was an honor.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend and leave us a review. It really helps, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. Produced by Lee Gugino, Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.